film that you have just seen, Four Waters, in collaboration with Arjuna Neuman. And it was first commissioned for last year's Berlin Biennale and is shown as the central work in Cosmopolis too. Denise is the director of the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Both her academic writing and her artistic practice address the ethical questions of our shared present and target particularly the metaphysical and epistemological dimensions of these questions and of modern thought. Her monograph, Towards a Global Idea of Race, raises the question of why, after more than 500 years of violence perpetrated by Europeans against people of color, there's no ethical outrage. And she's the principal editor of the series, Fractal series, Law, Race, and the Post-Colonial, that dissects that question in different ways, in different dimensions. She has advised and written for biennials, including the Liverpool and Sao Paulo biennials, and also Documenta 14. She has another work in the show, a collaboration with Valentina Desideri, which is the Sensing Salon that comes out of their shared poetical readings. And there will be another edition of the Sensing Salon tomorrow, as I mentioned. And Denise also joined us for Cosmopolis 1 2 years ago, and gave a talk addressing the so-called migrant crisis, migration, refugees crisis has various words, and talking about the workings of raciality and the ways in which certain bodies are consigned perpetually to zones of violence. And she also participated in a reading group session at that time. So now she is going to talk about one of the two films that she's made to date in collaboration with Arjuna Neuman. The early one was Serpent Rain from 2016. And so without any further ado, please join me in making Denise very welcome. We will have time for questions afterwards.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming, and I would like to thank Catherine, Ilaria, and the group of curators for Cosmopolis 2 for inviting me to be part of Cosmopolis again. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy that I get to see the exhibition as it's coming to an end. Okay, a confession, I have a text that I'm waiting for, but I will just start without it. And hopefully when it arrives, things will make sense. So you've seen the film, and I think some of you may have seen it a few times. I am very happy to talk about them, about the film during the Q&A. But what I have prepared for today is something that it is kind of like about, and at the same time within the film. As Catherine just said, my work in general, but also the collaboration in films with Arjuna and the Sensing Salon poetical reading collaboration with Valentina, they very much manifest or maybe reflect my preoccupations, my obsessions with the fact that our political discourse, both its the grammar in it and our lexicon, I find it's very resistant to actually to a comprehension of what obsesses me, which I call the major ethical political issues of the day. And as Catherine mentioned, that going through from the European refugee crisis all the way through the climate crisis, but also thinking about the conflicts, both the low intensity conflicts that we find in Latin America and the open wars that we see in the Middle East, and thank you, Elijah, and the African continent, and the ways in which these conflicts, while they generate a huge population displacements, at the same time they still allow for it. In my view, they facilitate extraction. At the same time, the continuing expropriation of labor and lands all across the global south, and including the expropriation that takes place through neoliberal reforms that extract not only things named material, but coming back from Brazil now, I have this feeling that it extracts even the will to live from people. Anyway, so those are the preoccupations that I find behind everything that I have written, and also of these works. One thing that I was thinking about talking about is primarily the ways in which these works, Four Waters, but also Serpent Rain, which was my first collaboration with Arjuna, and Soot, Breath, Corpus Infinitum, which is the next collaboration with Arjuna. The ways in which these works are trying to get at something that, for the lack of a better term, I'm going to call the infrastructure of thinking. I call them sometimes the onto-epistemological pillars of modern thought. There would be separability, determinability, and sequentiality. And this is what I would like to cover more today through a couple of things. One is an experiment which I think may give a sense of the distinction between, for instance, what in the film we refer to as lethal abstractions, and the kind of thinking, or maybe the kind of image of the world that would allow us to come up with both ethical and political descriptors. I don't want to talk about a text or a discourse, but at least ethical and political descriptors that might allow us to think of all those major political and ethical issues together. Because I think one of the problems we have is that we just don't connect dots that are more than obviously connected. So I have this experiment, which I would say relates to the intuitive moment, one of them, and then I have an image which might be helpful in terms of maybe in both ways, both in terms of identifying better descriptors, but also allowing us to come up with a comprehensible and yet complex account or accounts. Anyway, so now since I went through my introduction, let's see if there is anything else here I would like to say. Yeah, I think that is, well, the thing I wanted to say before is that in terms of establishing the distinction between these different modes of thinking is that both, all three of them, Serpent Rain, Four Waters, Deep Implicancy, and Soot, Breath, Corpus Infinitum, they try to present in different ways an image of the world which does not presume something like a mind, or what I have called the transparent eye, and its separation from something like a world, a body, and something that allows for descriptors that presume that every existent human and more than human is not only deeply implicated with every other singular existing thing, but in that deep implication or deep implicability constitute a corpus without limit, which I've been calling corpus infinitum. So these two things I'll share with you speak primarily to the philosophical side of the shifting thinking that I believe we are in really deep need of. So let me talk first about the experiment. Usually I ask people to do the exercise, but I'm not going to impose it on you, especially because I can't see you, so that changes a little bit how it goes. So I'll just talk about, I'll just talk through it. So the experiment has two parts. The first part tries implicancy and infinity, and then, oh no, sorry, the first part considers separability and unity, and then the second one tries implicancy and infinity, and it may or may not make sense, but then again we have time to talk about it. So the first part of the experiment begins with the question, how is it that separability precipitates unity? And then a term that I think gives away very quickly how it happens is circumscription. So, and then the invitation is one to try and image inside of your head circumscription. What kind of image will come to you? A circle, a square, a triangle, something with a center, probably. And then, but that's not enough to give a sense of separability and unity. So if we try and add some dots to this plane figure, put some dots all over the place on the edges of it, and then try to relate, for instance, try to relate one dot to another, like dots on the extreme sides of the circle, let's say. Even if you're taking into account everything else around it, if you try to relate dots on the extremities by going through the circle, you'll find, and then you can try, you'll find that you will always draw a straight line. There's no way of getting out of that. But if you try to connect 2 points by avoiding the circle, you will always draw a semicircle. Right? Of course, it's not always. There is an instance, a dimension at which that doesn't happen, but that's the whole point of the exercise, even though I'm not going to talk about it explicitly. So we realized that it doesn't, of course it depends on how far away a point is from another. So if you're trying to connect 2 points that are close, especially on one same quadrant, you might be able to draw, you'll be able to draw a straight line without going through the center of the circle. But if you, or even as you're trying to connect, but then otherwise you always draw a semicircle when you're trying to avoid the center. And no matter the shape of the contacts, drawing a semicircle is necessary if you want to connect 2 points on opposite sides without cutting through the center. Of course, it can be shown in different ways. You can have a mental image, which is this exercise. You can do the actual drawing, or you can just have an equation. And I do have an equation for the same circle at some point. You can do just a numerical, through a numerical representation. It's even possible to find any position in this particular context without having to know whether there is a dot there or not. Or another way of saying it, through the equations, An equation will tell me or you where the opposite side is, also regardless of whether there is something in there. So, and then once I'm able to determine that, you no longer even need to draw a line connecting the 2 points. All you need to know is the center and or the radius of the circle. So when tracking the trajectory of Plato's abstract figuring of the 4 elements, which you see at the beginning of each segment of the film, and tracking it from the creation of those solids through the building of atomic bombs and the consequences of their deployment in the tests in the Marshall Islands, the film figures a critique of the mode of thinking that both presupposes and yields separability and unity. Among other things that I'll touch a little bit later, this mode of thinking was crucial for the setting up and implementation of the tools of classical physics. But let me move to the second part of the experiment, the one in which I try implicancy and infinity. So now we can have the same dots, but instead of a flat surface or a circle, a square, or a triangle, we can image them as located in the context within which they are located as that it has a volume, a sphere, a cube, or even one of Plato's solids. But more than that, we can also image them as the basic constituents of that solid. And we can do something else with them once we start imaging them as basic constituents. We can see them vibrating in the same location. And my question here changes a bit, because it's not about drawing a line, because it's not about movement, right? They're vibrating in the same location. The question is, what happens to the gaps between them? Do the vibrations have any impact upon them? And we know they do. And I know because when I wave my hand, I can feel the air touching, moving around it. And when we throw a pebble on a lake, especially if it's a very small one, we can see the waves appearing on the lake. So what happens is that by moving my hand transfer energy, both internal kinetic energy, which is heat, and potential energy to the surrounding air, and that dislocates the particles. The pebble's impact transfers kinetic energy that moves across the water, like as the waves moves also as energy. Both transfers involve labor or work, meaning expenditure of potential energy, as well as, I mentioned before, heat, which is the transfer of internal kinetic energy. And actually, because every existing thing with a temperature above absolute 0 Kelvin, or minus 273.15 degrees Celsius, everything emits phonons, the quantum of solid matter, and or photons, the quantum of light at the infrared band of the electromagnetic spectrum. Even when neither my hand nor the air is moving, heat transfer of internal kinetic energy is taking place. Now, transfer of energy, should be noted, is transformation of energy from one kind into another. And like the previous image, of course, this one can also be formalized in different ways. So classically, it can be described using equations that present of thermodynamics, which measure the amount of kinetic energy being transformed between the dots or your fingers. Quantum field theory describes them as mathematical objects which relate to each other or to their context, and this is plotted in equations. Equations used to determine different properties such as energy, momentum, and the effect of these relationships that quantum physics is still described taking place in space-time, even though the things at that level usually fail to meet the expectations of these tools. But anyway, when we get to the second exercise, we no longer have dots, but we have atoms, molecules, electrons, and other things. The other things that constitute matter in all its different phases, solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. So, but why these examples? There are many reasons, and I'm not going to cover them, but in relationship to for waters, this experiment is useful because it allows me to highlight an important aspect of the mode of thinking that relies and yields lethal abstractions. Necessity. So in the first part of the example, for instance, necessitation comes immediately, while in the second part it comes late. Of course, the possibility of determination, as I said before, is in both, but in the second part of the experiment, it takes a while to show up. The first part, figures can postulate that mathematical statements yield syntactical judgments a priori. That is, they allow the addition to knowledge of something without recourse to what happens and exists in the world, that is, intuitively. And the second part of the exercise adds something, but it adds, there is knowledge in there too, at the intuitive level, but then there is a move a posteriori, to use the Kantian language. The vibrating dots can be imaged, but it is impossible to describe what happens in the surrounding gaps without recalling what happens when something releases energy as it vibrates, and even, of course, like the pebble or my hand, as it dislocates. But what's important here is not what happens to a given dot, how it moves or doesn't, whether it changes or doesn't. What happens is what matters. What happens regardless of whether a dot changes or moves. That is, what never stops is existence as the endless transformation of matter, energy, and this is what I usually call, I usually try to apprehend with the term decomposition. And it is almost impossible to find terms in our vocabulary that can convey the intrinsic materiality of this proposal for thinking. And in For Waters, we try and image it through the recurrence of phase transitions. So every segment which is identified marked by a solid and also the name of an element, they all have phase transition happening in them. And the serpent ring, for instance, our challenge for the film was how to make a film without linear time. And of course, we fail and do not fail to do it. And for the next film, actually, another challenge has to do with the film, the grain of the film itself, but we don't need to talk about the next one. But in any case, of course, the second part of the experiment refers to and yields abstractions just as the first one, but there is a different image of the world in there, and an image that's that I can sense in Leibniz's description of the plenum. I'm not going to quote Leibniz here, but basically his description is one of a universe in which every singular thing expresses everything as well as everything else, and the whole through its unique way. Of course, I do not wish to carry into considerations of implicancy and infinity Leibniz's final cause, which remains the divine ruler and creator, nor his rendering of substance, of form and matter. So I'm interested in his description of the plenum as infinite and contingent, and of its constituents as deeply implicated, but not in his description of these as self-actualizing individual substance, to whom the divine creator and ruler gave all that they need to contribute to the bringing about of perfection in the universe. What for waters and suppressed figure and serpent rain also is something that I have chosen to describe as a thinking that begins and stays with the thing instead of the transparent I or the I think. So I have some more things to say about that, but I think it's fine if I stop here. So let me just share with you the other image that I'm not going to show you, and then we can just talk. Yeah, lots of talking. So the other image I have is something that I try to. Actually, I'm just going to confess it. I had to share with a group of scientists, biologists, psychologists, and physicists my work, what I do. And I figured that I could spend hours and hours and hours trying to explain, and they would not get it, that stuff. So I decided to come up with an image, and the image is that of a banana. And the idea with the banana is, I'll just give it to you. It was a way of figuring what I call fractal thinking, which is also that mode of thinking that would allow us to come up with better descriptors and also to be more articulate when trying to bring together all these major ethical and political issues of the day. So I'll give you the image of the banana orally. So you know that banana is really good for your heart, right? If you don't have, and it's good for the heart because of the potassium that we find in bananas. If we don't have enough potassium, the heart will stop working. But the bananas are also found in, actually, they grow bananas in at least 135 countries. And that's pretty amazing because the bananas, they originate in South and Southeast Asia. So when I did look, try to figure out how come the bananas are everywhere, of course, I found out that the bananas were brought to Southeast Africa by the Islamic occupation conquest, and then the Portuguese brought it to the Americas, to South America, more particularly, and then the U.S. brought bananas to Central America and the Caribbean. But another interesting thing about the banana is that it is actually a measure for radiation, for contamination. So when you visit labs like CERN or other particle physics labs, they give you a dosimeter and then they tell you nothing will happen to you, it's fine, it's less, the radiation is less than bananas radiation. Of course, I don't believe them, but anyway, but the banana is an official measure for radiation. And it is precisely because of the potassium. The potassium has a 1.3, million years half-life. So it takes a while, but the potassium that we find in the bananas, it was produced in the supernova that took place many, many years after the Big Bang, but not that many years. It's the same potassium. So that worked with them, right? But then I told them, what I'm trying to come up with is a way of describing the world that takes into account at least those 4 dimensions. The organic, the heart health, the historical, the colonial history, the cosmic, the supernova, and the quantic, these still decaying elements that have been created very early in the history of the universe according to the Big Bang theory and remain operating and decaying in our bodies after we eat some bananas. Okay, thank you for the patience.
Very much, Denise. I'm going to throw it straight away to the audience to see if anyone has a question that they would like to ask in relation to the film and or Denise's discussion of her presentation. Well, I can kick off if no one immediately has a question. And I wanted to ask about the experience of filmmaking and starting to practice in that way with images, and if you could say something about what that has been like for you over these two films and the coming project.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, it's been initially when Stephen Horney commissioned the film with Arjuna, from me and Arjuna. I wasn't resistant because I tend to say yes to anything, most things that seem like I would be able to learn something. But I think the main aspect of it was the aspect of the process of after saying yes and then how do you do it, was two things. One was how to convey thinking through images. I didn't know how to do it. I can write about ideas using images, but I didn't know how to do it. And with Arjuna, I learned how to do it with Arjuna as we were editing Serpent Rain, and I said no to the many hours of filming me talking, and we had to then come up with these with something that was the ideas, but it was also something else, something that it's not discursive. So and then the second thing about it, I think it's what's the best way of describing it? I think it's basically the realization, and I think my banana example kind of has to do with it. I think it was the realization that the image and the sound, because the sound is very important in both movies, in Serpent Rain and in Four Waters, and then it will be important in the next one. The image and the sound, they work at a level that it's not so much about conveying an idea, so we do that with the phase transitions in this one, for instance, but it's really about, it's a moment of affect. So even when I try not to watch the films, but then when I hear the musicians in Haiti, the hara comes up, I know exactly what's happening there. And then it connects to the short phrase we have, or I think it's transformation, Rambo's elemental or something, I forgot which one. And the two of them connect in such a way that then gives to me, and I hope gives to everybody, the sense that that Haiti, in the moment of Haiti in that film, which is the Earth moment, is very crucial. It's a moment when things will shift. But that is something that it is in the sound and it is in the image. And if we were to write about it, it would take words. And then, as I said before at the beginning, the words would not necessarily convey what we had in mind. Something else that was, one more thing that, since we're looking at those images were very, the images of the refugees in the boats, that was a very as we were editing, we had so many different versions of those images. And like the image of the cop hitting somebody in serpent rain, my impulse was I do not want to show those images of violence. And but then at some point I realized that I would have to live with them because the film forces us to show the images. Or if we don't show those images, then the significance of these moments are not there. So this is, that was it's still very difficult. I still have, I look at the images like we have them, yes, we have them, we have to have them. And that comes with the format. It requires it. And yes, I want to say.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I love the mixture of sort of humanities and the hard sciences. I think that those interdisciplinary conversations are so difficult to have. My question is about sort of the changing phases. I mean, I know the work of Sigmund Bauman and his sort of notion of liquid modernity. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what relationship your work or your notions of sort of changing phases, if it's framed within those kind of notions of modernity, postmodernity, early modernity, or if this is a completely different kind of framework.
Yes, I think yes, is a different framework, yes, and then as I said before, it's almost impossible to really articulate what I mean by it because it's not very literal, it's very material. So by attending, for instance, going back to that banana fractal thinking example, by attending to the cosmic and the quantic at the same time, I'm really, really interested in an image of the world that takes into account the fact that, like, these particles that have been created, they back then in those nuclear synthesis and other primarily, but not only, and also supernova, that those particles are still here, right? So, and that what has been happening in space-time as it expands, it's primarily the simple word would be recycling. So several things. I'm not thinking in terms of metaphors. It's not an attempt to not Bauman now, but distinguishing from new materialisms and other contemporary philosophical theoretical moods. I'm not interested in then saying that matter matters because matter is alive or matter is what. I think matter matters because it is matter and it's the same thing that keeps. So if an image of the world that takes that into account, I think would shift completely the modes through which not only we inhabit the world, but also how we would also make the we, meaning here the human, indistinguishable from everything else. And that would no longer be even about relationships, not about changing relationships. It's changing, it's changing how we exist. So that's the. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this beautiful film.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question that's really small, actually. I'm just wondering, when you're talking about the way that you came about the images and the work with images, I think you said something like, at some point I ruled out the possibility that there would just be long shots of me talking. And I'm wondering why? Why did you reject that as a possibility? What does that do that you feel like isn't useful in this context?
Well, several answers. I'll give you the ones, the one I think that I can live with, because No, I think I got very because it was not going to do the work of conveying what, for instance, in Serpent Rain, we are trying to convey, which is basically answering the question that we have in the film, how to figure the human through the elements, which is also displacing the transparent eye, I think, that displacing that subject. If I were to stand there like I'm standing here and talking about my ideas about how to displace the human, that human that it's me was going to occupy the film, or the human would, that subject would reoccupy the film. And we have had a similar conversation about the next film that somebody suggested, maybe we should have an actor. And I am completely against it, because in the same way that the images of the refugees or the images of the cop beating up that person in Serpent Rain brings about the whole of modern representation into the film, and then it threatens to kind of like not so much create a contradiction, but totally take over what we are trying to do. Having me talking about these ideas in that way would, I think, or having an actor talking about the ideas in the next film would just describe that figure. It's more, and that's the advantage of the images, right? Because these, they do that image before, and this one, for instance, talking about lethal abstraction. I do not have to talk about the Marshall Islands, and what it is meant. It's there. It gives it there to me. Yes. And then I can stand my voice, but that's we have a lot of it in this one, which is great.
Unless there were one last question, we might close there, and we will be moving to another presentation by Yana Kisukiri that also will refer to Denise's film, amongst other things. But first, would you join me in thanking Denise very much for this?